Zach, thank you so much for coming on to the Basketball Performance Podcast. You're so generous with your time. But before we get into the questions and everything like that, can you just give us a brief background about yourself? How did you get into hoops? Where are you from? And then how did you transition into coaching after you graduated?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm super excited to be on your show. It's pretty cool that you got another brother from Jersey who I'm talking to right now, who lives basically on the other side of the world, and we're able to connect here and talk basketball, and it's pretty cool. I'm originally from Philadelphia, so I grew up in Philly, going to school in Philadelphia. Lived in South New Jersey, actually. Was a Division II recruited baseball player. Baseball was my best sport coming out of high school. Had some Division III basketball opportunities. Didn't really like any of the schools that were recruiting me. Tried to walk on to the George Washington University baseball team. Didn't make the team and wound up being a scout guy, a practice player for the women's basketball team there. So people around the world may not realize, but in women's college basketball in the US, typically the players practice against male practice players every single day in practice. And these are typically guys that are playing pickup at the rec. They could have played D3 ball or D2 ball. They played certainly high school varsity basketball, and they still want to be part of the team, and they get gear and shoes and get to come to practice every day. And that's what I did at GW for a guy named Joe McEwen. Joe McEwen, who was the head coach at GW at the time, he's now the head coach at Northwestern University near Chicago. And he had an unbelievable run at GW, and he was also a Philly guy. So that's what kind of got me into women's basketball, just being around women's basketball while I was in college my entire 4 years there, and started coaching some high school ball when I got out of college, and wound up backing my way or lucking into a Division III head coaching job, and my career kind of took off from there.
Really cool. So what kind of, for the young coaches out there, what's the kind of mindset as a young coach that you feel like you have to go in with? Because you put your head down, work hard, and do everything you can to make your players and coaching staff better. It seems like one thing just leads onto another. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think you've got to be willing to do extra stuff as a young coach that's going to set yourself apart from a lot of people who may like the idea of being called coach and all the accoutrements that might come with it. But then there's a lot of the nitty gritty in there that once they get exposed to it, they're like, oh, I didn't realize coaching was like that. And I'll give you my personal story about how I kind of got my big break, so to speak. So I was a Division II assistant coach at a small school in Wilmington, Delaware, called Goldie Beacom College, right? A very difficult named school. And I was making, I don't know, I had a stipend of $3,500, and I was recruiting out of my dad's spare law office next to his office. And I decided that I wanted to meet Division I coaches. So I actually wrote a letter in one summer, this was in the early 2000s, to one program in every state, one university, one women's basketball program in every state. 50 letters went out. Say, hey, I'd like to work your elite camp. So elite camps are these camps that women's basketball programs host that are instructional camps. And there's also a recruiting element built into it. You want to get some of the best players that you're recruiting to show up to your camp so that now you can show them the school and you can work them out and they're competing and so forth and so on. And the only guy that wrote me back was a guy named Jeff House. And Jeff House was an assistant coach at the University of Virginia, all right, which was at the time under Debbie Ryan, a women's basketball power. And Dawn Staley had played there, and Tammy Rice had played there, and Wendy Palmer and played there, and so forth. And he wrote me back and he said, hey, listen, we got a lot of people come to our camp. We could use another hand. And that was it. And so this was out of 50 letters that went out. One guy got back to me and invited me down. And I started working their camps for the next, I don't know what it was, maybe 4 or 5 summers, to the point where I was actually running their elite camp down there. So they were almost like contracting me and bringing me down to run their camp. So maybe the second year that I did this, or the third year that I did this, Brenda Freeze at the University of Maryland, right? Unbelievable coach, Hall of Fame coach, has won a national championship, multiple Final Fours. She was creating a new position on her staff, scouting and player development position. Now, these are pretty common positions now on university staffs, but back then in the mid 2000s, late 2000s, those were kind of new positions. So Jeff House, the assistant coach, got to know her husband pretty well, a guy named Mark Thomas. And he said, hey, listen, I think I got a guy who could do that job pretty well for you. And so I got connected through Brenda through Jeff. And she offered me that job. I interviewed, obviously, and offered me that job. And 3 years later, I was in the Final Four, in the 2014 Final Four, and working with a great staff and working alongside, obviously, Coach Freeze and Tina Langley, who's the head coach at the University of Washington, was just the head coach at Rice University, and David Adkins, a guy named DA, who was one of the best player development guys in the world. He had just been an assistant right now with the Washington Wizards. He had been an assistant at the University of Maryland when I was there. And he actually coached Kevin Durant in high school at DeMatha Catholic and Montrose Christian. So this was a guy that I really learned from a player development standpoint and was a mentor to me. And that's how I kind of, went on my way with my career. But the idea of sending a letter out to, 50 states and catching a break, that I think set me apart to Coach House, to Jeff House, who was at Virginia at the time, than perhaps a lot of other people who were just trying to come down there and work camp and, get a check, and so forth and so on. So the advice that I give young coaches is, you got to be willing to go the extra mile and set yourself apart and make yourself valuable, right? Like provide value. In today's day and age, a lot of that comes with the ability to do graphics and social media, right? So older coaches don't have the ability to do that stuff. A lot of older coaches, in fact, need people to manage their Twitter or their Instagram account. So if you have the ability to step in as a young coach and say, yo, I'm a whiz with Photoshop, or I'm a TikTok, I got 50,000 followers on TikTok or whatever, that's immediate value that you can then provide to a program or a club or whatever. And that's a good way of setting yourself apart and providing value.
So interesting, because we're going to be talking a little bit about recruiting later on, but so many lessons that you just mentioned, I think can apply to players as well. But when you first got in the game, we were talking off air that I also coach girls basketball as well. Did you have it in mind that, you enjoyed teaching the women's game a little bit more than the men's, or did you just kind of fall into women's basketball?
Yeah, you know what? I never even gave the comparison a thought, and that's the honest truth. To me, right, when you're coaching women's basketball, you're not saying, well, I'm coaching women's basketball. I always just think of it as I'm just coaching basketball. Right. And, kind of a funny aside about that is in my social media bios, it just says associate head basketball coach at Towson University. There's no gender, because on the men's side, there's no gender, right? Mm-hmm. So on the women's side, I don't list gender. And what actually winds up happening is I get 2 dozen DMs a day from male basketball prospects and actually even American football prospects. Just actually, no kidding, yeah. Who actually assume that you're the men's basketball coach or you coach men's basketball. But I've never ever seen it as that. When I was a scout guy in college, if you didn't guard Marshik Witherspoon, she was going to cross you up. If you didn't close out Kathy Jones, who wound up going on to a great career with the Chicago Sky, she was going to drill a 3 in your eye from 26 feet. So it's like, well, that doesn't really matter what gender you are, right? Like 3 ball is a 3 ball, right? A crossover is a crossover. And I never even gave it a second thought. And frankly, I've been so invested in the game. I coached high school boys basketball for 1 year. And ever since then, I've been on the women's side. And I've been so invested in the women's side, I've never even given the men's side a second thought.
Right. And now you have such a wealth of experience and knowledge when it comes to game, because you've done it at, again, the male, boys side, girls side, men's side, women's side, high school, college. I know that a big part of your responsibility is recruiting and being able to watch film. And me personally, I would really like to learn from you when it comes to that, because I always want to know what coaches are looking for when they're scouting another team or even recruiting a player. And I heard that you were talking about themes when looking at other teams. Can you talk a little bit about that? I'm very interested in what that means.
Yeah, so you obviously watched the podcast I did with Jen Fay, who's an assistant coach at Quinnipiac University, and she's terrific. And that podcast dealt with, when it comes to scouting opponents, right? How do you go about doing it, right? And a lot of coaches do it a lot of different ways. And one of the things that I think gets best translated to your team when you're trying to scout another team and break down the film and explain what it is that they do, both on film, on paper, right, on the court, is creating themes of the other team. So what does this team do mainly? What are the 2 or 3 main things that this team does? Offensively, they want to score in the paint, or they're setting a ton of flare screens in their motion offense, or defensively, they're going to ice ball screens, or defensively, they are playing make miss, right? They're man-to-man on misses, and they're in zone, whatever it is. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to create this construct of this team in a broad sense, in a macro sense, so that when you're now starting to provide the details to the team, they understand that this is how it fits into those broad parameters, right? So for example, like a team that wants to score in the paint, right? Well, now how do they go about scoring in the paint? Well, a lot of downhill drives, or they're always looking to duck in the post in the weak side, or whatever it is. And those details often don't even matter. Like, they matter because it's strategy, but they're really ancillary to what the themes actually are. If we tell a team, okay, to beat this team, you've got to stop them from getting into the paint, you got to keep them off the offensive glass, and you got to make sure you don't over penetrate because they swarm and attack the ball. Without knowing like any of the X's and O's behind that, if your team has those things in mind and they execute the game, they play the game and execute the game plan based on those things in mind, you have a good chance of winning. So that's where it comes from, themes. The other thing that we do at Towson, and I've done in other places, is we do what are called how to beats, okay? And so not only are we showing what the other team does well, but on both the offensive and defensive side of the ball, we like to show how we're going to beat them. And it can often be other teams that have employed a technique or a strategy that's similar to what it is what we do. So for example, we're a very high up-tempo team. We're a top 25 pace team in the country. So if we're playing an opponent who has trouble in their last 5 games they played stopping transition offense, then we'll link together those clips and say, hey, look, they can't stop transition. We want to get out in transition, right? Or on the other hand, like, for example, defensively, okay, they struggle to make the extra pass. This is not a good passing team. So if we contain the initial action, it's going to break down. And we show teams doing that on film also. So those 2 things when it comes to scouting opponents: themes, what do they like to do on the whole? And then how are we going to go about beating this team on the offensive defensive end? Really helps our kids get an overall sense of what it is we want to do in this game.
Okay. And so what about if you look at it from a micro level and you're looking at a certain player? They might have like a top 25 in the country scorer or a 3-point shooter or something along the lines of that. What kinds of patterns do you look for when dialing it down to a player? Like patterns, tendencies, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think, what you got to understand is that good players are going to try to figure out how to get theirs, right?
Yep.
And so one of the things that we want to do is we want to make good players inefficient. That's what we want to do, right? So if somebody's averaging, let's say, 20 a game in our league, well, we want them to have to take 20 shots to get 20 points, okay? If they take 20 shots and they've gone, 6 of 20 from the floor and they hit a couple of free throws and, now they're at 20 points, that's a pretty inefficient day for them. Yep. Now, if they go, 7 for 9 from the floor, right, and hit 6 free throws, well, then we didn't do our job. So when it comes to individual players, right, players who are really good, you're not going to stop all parts of their game. So we try to identify whether a player is a driver first, a shooter first, or a 50-50 player, meaning they probably do both equally well. There's very few players that are truly 50-50 players, right? And sometimes you have to break it down to your players, like this is actually why this player is a shooter first. So let's say a kid has made 20 field goals, right? And 8 of them are threes, right? So 8 times 3 is 24. So the other 12 field goals are twos. 12 times 2 is 24.
Yep.
And so the kids might look at that, and I say kids are players, right? They may look at that, well, they're like, that's even, right? It's still 24. Except the twos, you need 4 more shots to get to 24 than you do with the threes. Right. And now all of a sudden you see the light bulb goes on, and that's what makes them, oh yeah, they're a shooter first. The other thing then that we try to do is we try to take away the best player on the other team, right? So maybe that's we load our help side defense, what we call our white line, right? Maybe it is even in a face guard denial if we feel like that player's been really hot in previous games. Now, once you get past that level of player, like that top tier, first team, all conference player, once you get past that, now players generally have 1 or 2 primary tendencies, you know? So for example, post player, right? Likes to go over her left shoulder to score. She can go over her right shoulder, but she primarily likes to go over her left shoulder. So we'll say in the scout, okay, kill left shoulder, right? Take away that left shoulder completely. Or a player likes to go left to her pull-up, right? Like we're playing a player, a game on Friday, and they got a player who is all left hand. She is left, 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 right? So we want to take away that left hand completely. And we feel like we take away a player's primary tendency, especially once you get past that top tier player, you're going to do a pretty good job of stopping that player, you know? And that's kind of how we identify players and make sure that our players know the tendencies of the players that they're going up against.
Nice. So say you guys have put all this work in, you've dialed it from a macro standpoint, a micro standpoint, but now it's time to put it into practice in a scouting report with your players. And we all know as coaches that the working memory is going to be going a little bit crazy because there's pressure for game, all that kind of stuff. How do you go about presenting it to them? Would say, for example, would a guard need to know the strengths and weaknesses of everybody on the court, or primarily who they're going to be matched up with? So would the positions be matched up with the positions, or do you kind of have everybody knowing what everybody's going to be doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So number one, when it comes to personnel, we want everybody to know what everybody's going to do. Mm-hmm. Now, we try we don't show an entire roster's worth of film, right? We'll typically show the top 8, top 9 on the other team. And then we try to often group players together, you know? So for example, like, okay, 2 big body posts, right? They score mainly on dump offs off the drive. Oh, okay. So now these 2 players are similar. Number 24 and number 15 score on dump offs off the drive. We know that we got to make sure we rotate, and we have the help, what we call the drop down, the help the helper, right? So forth and so on. When we start film though, on a new scout though, we try to have the same process every time, which is that we give them a paper scout that they can read, because you have to understand that every player digests information differently, right? Some can read it on the paper, some can see it on the film, some have to go through it on the court, right? We give them a paper scout. On the front page of the scout, it'll list that team's general tendencies. What do they like to do offensively? What do they like to do defensively? What might they struggle with? So forth and so on. Any statistics that might really stand out when you're going to play that team. You know, for example, like maybe 41% of this team's points come on 3-pointers. Okay, so we know we got to take away the 3. Okay, so we start with that, and then we typically start with that team's identity, which is those themes that I'm talking about, right? So we'll have 2 or 3 themes, and we call it identity also. This is what this team is about. If you didn't know any of these players on the floor and who they were and what their numbers were and what their stats were, and you just watched this team play and what would be the idiosyncrasies of this team that stand out. And honestly, if you stopped your scout there, you would have a pretty good idea, a chance of winning the game without even knowing the personnel. So, for example, if we're getting ready to play, let's say, a really strong three-point shooting team, we would say, okay, one of the ways that they may score is threes. And we would say, how do they get their threes? Well, they might get them in transition. They might, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of off of flare screens, ORB threes, offensive rebound kickout threes, right? Like whatever it is. So we show those teams first. And and this is day one of the scout, then we'll show the personnel. And we'll show 7 to 10 clips of a kid. And again, we're not going to show every single thing that they do. We're going to show their main tendencies. So then once we do that, now in their head, they have an idea of what it is they're going up against. And now it's our responsibility as coaches then to identify probably two of their three of their most frequently run sets or plays. And now we go against them in practice, right? And we use our scout guys. And so then the next day on film, hey, okay, here they are running their horns action, right? So we just did that on the court yesterday. So now we're going to see it on the film today of how they do it. And so now you're putting these building blocks together and molding the scout together. And hopefully at the end of that, it just clicks for them if you're explaining it correctly.
How big has that practice scout team of guys been for you? I was talking a little bit off the air, what we do with girls here in Hong Kong as well. And we have our own practice squad of boys, right?
Mm-hmm.
How big has that been for you guys? And do you see any challenges? Because I'd love to exchange ideas with you in terms of like athleticism difference.
Yeah. So having a good scout team is absolutely essential in the women's game or the girls' grassroots game. There's no question about it. Objectively speaking, there is going to be a size and a speed differential. Right. Not all the time, right? But in most circumstances, right. That's just the biology of it, you know? Right. And so when you're using a male scout team, number one, if your players are competitive, they recognize that if they play soft, if they play slow, if they're careless with the ball, if they don't screen well, that the play is not going to be made, number one. Number two, in general, in the girls' game and the women's game, and again, this is just a generalization, but in general, women will be, and girls and female athletes on team sports will be more competitive against others than they will be against themselves. And there's a social dynamic to that also, right? There's a social dynamic to it. You know, our players are on the same team as their other teammates, right? So yeah, they're going to go hard at them, but they're also their teammates. Whereas if you bring a bunch of dudes in here, right, they know that they can go at them, and now the team is all together, and now the scout guys are the enemy, you know? Right. So for example, we do a great drill, and you want to talk about, you know, trading ideas. We do a great drill that forces our players to match the male scout guys' physicality. We call it bubble transition. Now there's different variations of it. But all you're doing is if you have a bubble, you put the bubble in the rim. You've seen the rebounding bubbles. Have you ever seen one of them?
I think I know what you're talking about, but yeah.
It's like a fiberglass bubble. It has little.
It goes over the rim.
Right, and you shoot it, and you can't make the shot, and it bounces out. Right.
Yep.
So we do a drill where we shoot the ball. The coaches or whomever shoot the ball at the bubble, and the guys come in and crash, and our team has to box them out. You know, you got to put a body on them, and we keep track of we scored or whatever, you know. Little things like that forces your team to match the physicality of the scout guys. Now, we do put limits on our scout guys. Like, for example, we say you can't come in and fly in from the weak side and block a shot, right? Can't do that. No dunking, okay? We don't allow dunking. We always say watch where you land, don't undercut players and so forth and so on. But once the guys kind of get that gauge of, okay, like if one of their players is coming slamming into me and I hold my own, like I'm doing my job there, you know? Having that competitive level in practice every day of having your players, your girls' players going against male athletes is huge.
Yep.
You know, we've all heard that expression, she plays like a dude, right? Like I coached Alyssa Thomas at Maryland, okay? AT grew up playing with her brother and her brother's friends. So she knew how to absorb contact and manipulate her body. We had a player graduate from us last year who got drafted by the Las Vegas Aces, Kiana Jeter. Mello, she goes by Mello. Mello played like AI. She played like Iverson. She had a pull-up game like Allen Iverson. Well, you don't get that just playing AAU ball, you know, with other female athletes your age, right? You got that because you played in the park and the playgrounds with your cousins or, you know, the boys at your age group or whatever it is. So having a male scout team is absolutely crucial.
And so how often, because I'm learning a ton here, how often do they play, say, I'm just going to go red and white, that's our colors.
Mhm.
How often do they play red and white amongst themselves and then the practice squad comes in?
We are always playing against the practice guys.
Okay.
Every single day in practice. Now, if we do a competitive drill, like for example, if we have a competitive shooting drill that has, let's say, we're black and gold, you guys are red and white, whatever. The scout guys aren't involved in the competitive shooting drill, right? So let's say we're using our main arena and we have just 2 baskets down because we're getting ready to play or whatever it is in our main arena, and we have 2 teams going, that'll be black and gold. But when it's competitive for a strategy component or a pure competition component where the actual game of basketball is involved, then we go against our scout guys every single day.
This is awesome, Zach. I'm learning so much.
Good. I'm glad.
How do you guys go about tackling skill development? Is it something that is only for the off season? Is it something that you guys do throughout the season? And how do you guys do it that you might feel like is maybe a little bit different from other places that you've seen since you have so much experience?
Yeah, I mean, we place a huge premium on skill development. In fact, that's one of the things that when we're recruiting and we have prospective athletes coming into our arena in the office and we're recruiting them, that we talk about extensively. So my background as a player development guy involves having coached a number of WNBA players. Jonquel Jones, right, the reigning MVP, having been one of them. So our head coach, Diane Richardson, she actually brought Jonquel Jones over from the Bahamas and is kind of like her adopted mother. And Coach Rich and I were assistant coaches together at George Washington University, and I helped develop JJ. And so what we try to do is we try to take a baseline of skill sets for players that we've developed in the past, whatever the position is, and then apply them to the players that we're trying to develop. So, for example, I actually believe I've coached guards in the past. I coach post players, right? Now, a lot of times everybody asks, what's the 5'11" guy doing coaching post players? And I say, well, my mantra is Hakeem Olajuwon said, when my back is to the basket, I'm a post, and when I'm facing the basket, I'm a guard, right? So, I mean, Carmelo Anthony, Elena Deladon, Jonquel Jones, like these are all post-up players who can post you up and then face the basket and take you off the bounce, you know, so forth and so on. So we place a huge premium on the player development. The entire summer is player development stuff, and our preseason is player development as well. A lot of teams, college programs, when they get their entire team there in the summer or in the fall, they immediately jump into team stuff, running plays and defensive concepts and so forth. And we think that there's more than enough time to get that stuff in. And we want to continue to teach players how to get better throughout the season, no question about it. So even now, like when we're, 3/4 of the way through the season, we've got 6 regular season games coming up left in our conference tournament. We'll still do a 10-minute guard post breakdown in practice every day, and it might not be that you're learning something new, but you might be reaffirming something that, oh, I let this slip because I haven't used it in a couple of days or a couple of games, or, here's a skill set that we saw on film that you really want to adopt for your game. Okay, cool. Let's try it. So heavy premium on player development. And I think that's actually different than a lot of places in the country, right? A lot of places in the country will say, okay, well, in the summer, we'll do 2 days of player development stuff, and then it's all team stuff. And then once we get into fall preseason, it's all team. And any player development stuff you want to do, it's on your own, getting shots or extra work or whatever it is. And we think that our players' day is so packed anyway. Like they do come in and get extra shots, but we want to try to set that tone from the jump. And I'll say this also, Will, like the majority of players that are coming into us, especially coming out of high school, not necessarily transfers, but high school, are really lacking in fundamentals, How to use your pivot feet, how do you throw a chest pass properly? How do you throw an overhead pass properly? What does a good defensive stance look like? And like, even when we get new players here in the summer, we walk around the basketball court and say, what is this area of the basketball court called? And it's like, this is the right elbow, or what's this area? Oh, this is the short corner, or whatever. And so you really have to be an instructor. You have to be a teacher of the game, like you mentioned, and not just say, okay, now we're going to run plays. And I think that's where successful programs are able to do that. And, they incorporate the player development piece alongside with it.
Do you think that it's important in the player development piece to add a component of decision-making and reaction, rather, like, say, for example, when I was growing up, right, I would have coaches tell me to do stationary ball handling for like 10, 20, 30 minutes.
Right.
Whereas, like, I think we can all agree now that it might not be the best way to teach ball handling. Is there elements of certain drills where you're getting players to make reads off of certain things, all that kind of, and incorporating reaction into the drills?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, we are we are very much anti-cone drill. I can tell you that right now. We make a joke that the cones don't play any defense and the cones don't move. And what's happened, especially in the US system of play, is you've got these trainers out there, right? And these trainers, come with varying degrees of expertise, and they have access to a gym, or they get access to a gym, or whatever it is. And they do a lot of these predetermined cone drill moves, whatever, so that you can film it and then put it on Overtime or social media or whatever. And now you're selling your business. But the reality is, in a college game, you might not get more than 3 dribbles before you have to give up the ball. So we do incorporate a lot of read-based stuff in our player development, and a lot of it comes with bringing the scout guys in when we're doing player development stuff, and we say, well, I'll tell the guys, all right, listen, like, all right, we'll go through a series and we'll instruct the series. Like, so for example, like, let's say we're working on different stationary space makers. Okay. So let's say we're working on long jab steps and shot fakes, or what I call a sit and show. Okay. And so I might say to our player, okay, you get 2 dribbles and I'll pass you the ball, right? And you can reverse pivot into what we call a reverse out, reverse pivot into whatever it is. But the only 2 moves you can use are a long jab and a shot fake.
Right.
Okay. And it's your job to create space. You can either shoot the ball, and once you get them off balance, you can rip, you can pull up, whatever it is, right? But you have to put your players in a position where they're playing live basketball against a defender after you've instructed the technique that you want, right? Like, here's how I want you to pivot, or here's how I want you to make this move, or whatever it is. But once you've done that, like, the cones are stationary. They don't move. In basketball, the whole thing is fluid, right? And so you got to be able to figure out, like, okay, how do if my defender reacts this way to this move, what's the counter move, or what's my secondary move? And then in a team setting also, then you've got to be able to react to what the defense is doing, So you might do a drill where you're saying, okay, I'm going to penetrate middle, and you sucked in the defense on the weak side, and they're rotating. You got to figure out which one of these 2 players is open, and then they got to make the extra pass, or whatever it is, whatever the drill is. So absolutely, you've got to incorporate a realism to your player development and not just say, okay, we're going to do these drills and now you're going to be a better basketball player, because that doesn't translate to the game.
Absolutely. I love that you mentioned the cones. I always use the analogy of Bruce Lee saying that boards don't hit back.
That's a great one. Absolutely. They don't, right?
Right. And so similar, the cones don't move. The cones don't give you any sort of like external stimulus on what you have to do. So I completely agree with that. So one thing that I didn't tell you is before this interview, I actually watched your last 2 games, and you guys had great games. But the one thing that really caught my attention the most is it seemed like you guys have such a close-knit family there. Like everybody, like from the coaching staff to the players. Can you tell me a little bit about the culture that you guys have there? And I mean, I'm on the other side of the world, and I was looking at your team. I was like, God, this is a close-knit team. Like they're whatever they're doing it right. So can you talk a little bit about your culture? What do you guys do daily to kind of get together, really tighten the bond? What are some of the things that you guys do together to build that strong culture?
Well, if you watched our 2 last games, then you have seen where we were 1 missed box out away from beating Delaware. So that still sticks out in our crawl. But I appreciate you saying that and doing your homework there. Culture is an often used word, right? And sometimes people can't really identify what it is. Okay. To me, culture is intertwined with leadership.
Okay.
So when you have strong leadership, however that person behaves and acts and treats people, and the energy that person provides, that's going to be contagious to everybody else who falls under the umbrella of that leader, right? So we have an unbelievable head coach, Diane Richardson. She's known as the queen of the DMV. So for those who don't know, DMV is DC, Maryland, and Virginia. Okay. So she was a high school coach at Riverdale Baptist, which is a power, and started the program there and is really well known in the area. And everybody who's ever come in contact with Coach Rich at any point in their career has a story to tell, right? About how something Coach Rich said or something she did rubbed off on them, So because we have very strong leadership with Coach Rich, now there's been a baseline set for how we expect our players to act with each other. Now, the first thing we want them to be is as authentic as possible. If you look at our roster, we recruit players from all over the world. We just graduated somebody from the Ukraine last year and from Germany. We got players from down the street in Baltimore and everywhere in between. Every background, every demographic, every identity, whatever it is, right? So that's the first thing, is we want our players to be authentic and feel like they can be authentic. And I think that in and of itself creates a level of trust in your program. So there's a lot of programs out there that want their players to be kind of robots, right? And act a certain way all the time. They all got to act and talk and say in unison. We want our players to be loose. We want our players' personalities to shine. That's one of the things that has gotten us some notoriety as a program, which is things like you mentioned, like your players always seem like they're having a great time. Well, they feel like they can be themselves with each other. So that's the number one thing, right? And the second thing that we talk about all the time is when it comes to accountability, and that's another buzzword, right? That a lot of teams be accountable. Everybody's got to be accountable. Well, we talk about listening to content of what somebody is telling you and not tone. Listen to content and not tone, especially when you're talking about female athletes, right? Like when you're talking about female athletes, you have to be very cognizant of tone, because often women hear, and again, generalization, but they will hear tone first. So we talk about, listen, if a coach is giving you instruction, right? Or one of your teammates is coming to you with a suggestion or constructive criticism or whatever it is, listen to the content and separate that from the tone, right? Separate that from the tone. And if you're able to do that consistently, then you're going to hear the message and not how it's being delivered, right? So for example, Coach Rich, she will go up to every player on our team and give them a huge hug and put her arm around them and then say, hey, listen, I really need you to go box out, right? Like you're not doing a good enough job boxing out, or you've got to use your left hand more, or whatever it is, right? And kids might say, okay. And then I might go around and put my foot up the backside of every kid on a team and say, yo, you got to box out. And what we try to do is try to broadcast the same message, the same content in multiple ways so that you're removing the emotion from hearing that criticism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, completely. That's so powerful. Yeah.
And every coach has their own voice, right? Every coach has their own way of doing stuff. And so if you can get your players to listen to what it is that their teammates are saying, like, for example, a lot of times players don't want to hear what their teammate has to say because they think that it's a personal attack. Well, reaffirming to your players, hey, listen, what Aaliyah is telling you is not a personal attack. Listen to what she's saying. And then you let the player make her point, maybe in front of everybody. Hey, listen, when you set that screen, right, set it this way because their defender's overplaying or whatever it is. And that allows you now to remove the reactionary emotion from that. So those two things, right? The authenticity that everybody in our program is allowed and expected to display. Number one, coaches all on the way down, right? And number two, the accountability when it comes to hearing what it is people are telling you and not listening to how they're saying it to you. And we don't get it right all the time, you mess up, coaches mess up, players mess up talking to each other. But if you can get it right more than you get it wrong, then you're going to see that in those interactions, that culture that you see that comes across on film.
That's very powerful. I'm using that and I'm keeping that in mind next time I'm giving, or even if I'm getting, feedback and constructive criticism from someone, separating the tone from the content. That is really, especially in the heat of the game, right? Like it's very rare that someone can keep their cool and be like, hey, listen, can you do this a little bit better? It's usually going to be very emotional, right? Because it's in the middle of the game.
And sometimes also, right, as a coach, changing your approach to be contrary to your primary approach can also be a technique that you use, right? So for example, like if you're, on somebody, right? Listen, you got to cut, you're giving up the baseline still, like you're on them, right? You're on them, right? Then maybe the next time you walk up to them and talk to them very, very quietly.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, like maybe it is that way they're hearing it all of a sudden, but that's a real big key when it comes to coaching any athlete, any team sport. I think, again, just by the nature of it, I think when you're coaching female team sports and female basketball players, removing or teaching them to remove that reactionary emotion from what's being told to them. It's not a personal attack. I'm just trying to help you. And if you get them to understand that you're just trying to help, then they'll trust you and they'll listen to what it is you're saying.
Absolutely. That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, Zach, you contributed so much to so many people on the court, but when researching you, I found that you equally impact people off the court. Can you tell us a little bit about the education that you do for student athletes, especially when it comes to voting?
Yeah, absolutely. So aside from coaching basketball, right, we have, I think, a responsibility as coaches to teach younger people about the world around us, right, and the world around them, and how to be what I call an engaged citizen, right? An engaged citizen in your world, in your community, right? Whatever that may be. And obviously, in the United States, in the past couple of years, in the past 5 years, really, right? There's been a lot of turmoil when it comes to politics, when it comes to race issues, when it comes to social justice issues. And there's a lot of, there was an awakening among young people, frankly, that came to a head when George Floyd was murdered, right? And it was the perfect storm of things. We're in the middle of the initial onset of the pandemic. We had these social justice issues. Now we have a murder of an unarmed Black man that was filmed, so everybody in the world can see. And all these young people wanted to do something, right? And they didn't quite know how to go about actually affecting some level of change beyond being involved in a protest, which is very, very important, right? And standing out there on a megaphone and having a sign and making your voice heard, and that's very, very important. The dovetailing of the George Floyd murder, the pandemic, and then the onset or the upcoming 2020 election at that time was kind of like this perfect brew where I kind of realized here's an opportunity to get student athletes around the country invested and involved in the civic process, because you had a lot of emotions. You had a lot of people all of a sudden saying, this isn't right, I want to do something about it, but not knowing how to go about doing that. So for much of the second half of 2020, I would say starting in July on all the way through November through the election, I did Zoom style election scouting reports with different basketball programs, different athletic departments, entire conferences, associations like the WBCA throughout the country. And I presented kind of almost like a civics lesson, right, to these individual teams or these groups or whatever in the form of a scouting report, right? So now all of a sudden you're approaching something that in our country is often deliberately made opaque. You know, this voting process, this election process, how does somebody actually get elected? What does Congress do? Why is the Supreme Court being talked about suddenly? Who's this Ruth Bader Ginsburg person? Like all this stuff, right? And it's like, we have a system here that's designed almost to prevent people from wanting to get invested. Right. And now all of a sudden you have all these groups of people who are like, what does all this mean?
Yeah.
And you need to break it down to them in a way and in style that feels comfortable and feels like something they're already used to. And I thought scouting reports were the best way to go about doing that. So I probably presented to, I think the count was over 3,500 student athletes around the country. I think it was like 53 or 54 of these different election scouting reports. I would microtize them to the state that the team or the university or the association was in or whatever, because we had a lot of athletes, student athletes, it was their first time voting. They didn't know that elections were done at the state level, right? And there's different rules in every state and so forth and so on. And then I did that. I created my own organization called the SAVE Alliance, which stands for Student Athlete Voter Engagement. I then coordinated with another nonprofit group called Coaches for Change. And I was brought in to be their voting engagement coordinator. And then on campus at Towson University, I helped form a student-led group called TU Athletes Vote, which is it's a nonpartisan education and engagement organization that works with our student athletes to get them involved in the voting process as well. We were lucky and continue to be lucky that we have an on-campus voting location. It's actually right next to our basketball arena. So during the 2020 election, the only people that were really on campus because of the pandemic were athletes, and everybody volunteered to help facilitate the voting process on campus. So directing with parking, helping people get into the facility, signage, so forth and so on. And so the point of all of this, in my mind, was to create what I call habitual voters. And if you look at the statistics of young people, right? If you want to call it Generation Z, whatever you want to call it, young people who voted in the 2020 election compared to any other election prior, the numbers were through the roof, right? They were astronomical. And for what it's worth, if what I did and helped, coordinate and facilitate and work with other groups and so forth, helped invest young people in the civic process, then they're going to turn and show up for the 2022 midterms and then the 2024 elections. And then you talk about culture, you've now created a culture within individual teams. So now if you were a freshman in 2020 and that was your first time voting in an election, right? By the time you're a senior and you're voting for a new president or in another presidential election, 2024, now you've got freshmen in your program who are doing it for the first time. You say, hey, listen, this is how you fill out an absentee ballot, or here's how you look up who's going to be on your ballot and what they stand for. And the last point I'll make on this is I always said to every team that I presented to and all these young people, I said, you don't need to be an expert on Iranian nuclear policy,
right,
in order to be an engaged voter. All you got to do is pick one or two issues that matter to you, and they could be anything. And all of a sudden, when you start naming stuff to these kids, like maybe police oversight, right, or body camera laws, or increased minimum wage, or it could be abortion laws or gun laws or whatever it is, like you can see that light bulb. Once you figure out what those issues are that matter to you most, that's how you invest yourself in an election, in the voting process. Who espouses policy that most closely reflects my views on this issue? And then you need to vote for them. Because you can stand on the corner and you can yell and have the megaphone and all that, and that's great. And that's done a lot, and it's created a lot of change in any decade in this country. But the way that you get change, and it's not all overnight,
right,
it's incremental, is by going to the voting booth and casting your ballot. And huge passion of mine, in addition to coaching basketball. And hopefully those habitual voters will pass that dialogue and that information on to others.
Well, I'm so impressed, and I really commend you for doing that, because if you live in a country, you better know how the system works. And in the United States, you have that right to vote, and that's something that some people might take for granted, because not every country in the world
Absolutely.
has that right.
Absolutely.
So I'm completely behind you on that, and
I think if you were to explain to the average American, doesn't even have to be a young person, the average American, the relationship between China and Hong Kong, it would blow. They couldn't fathom it, and that idea of, like you said, like taking elections, like, because you do, and it's not, you have a lot of, well, what does it matter who I vote for, right? Like that's not new, right? That's, you had, in 2000 when I was in college, right? You had excuse me, in 2002, actually 2000 election, you had Bush and you had Gore and you had people voting for Ralph Nader. What does it matter? Like, they're all the same, right? Like, that's not a new thing. That's been going on since elections have been created, but if you can break it down to the human level, to the personal level, and say, this is why, why do you need to vote for your mayor, right? Well, the mayor appoints the chief of police. And so if you don't like the way that the chief of police is acting, or you want new body camera laws implemented or whatever it is, then you got to vote in a new mayor who can put in a new person, whatever it is, and that's just an example. But the idea of taking things for granted, I think plays a role in the basketball side of things, right? Is, like you said, you had your first ever female athlete come to play in the United States, and they're playing at a school that, frankly, if you don't know colleges, you're not involved, or you're not from Boston, or you don't know Andy Untitled, you've never heard of it, but it's a huge deal for you. We run into a problem here in the United States all the time, where you got a lot of players who feel like they're entitled to be Division I basketball players. Right. They're entitled to a scholarship. They're entitled to these NIL deals where they're making bank off it because they're able to rep Chipotle or Nike or whatever. They're getting cost of attendance money on top of their scholarship. And so I think is it generational? Is it universal? Is it an American problem? Like, that's a larger discussion. But I think the kernel of truth that you mentioned there, which is the right to vote, the right to play basketball, right? The privilege doesn't always exist elsewhere.
Definitely, definitely. Well, it's so impressive, everything that you're doing on and off the court. Where can people find out more information about you?
Yeah, so our program, Towson University, we are the second largest university in the state of Maryland. So we have 20,000 undergraduate students, 5,000 graduate students. We're a suburb of Baltimore, so we're 15 minutes from Baltimore, 45 minutes from Washington, D.C. We're right on the East Coast. It's a beautiful school. So you can check that out at towsontigers.com. If you want to find out more about me, I'm very active on Twitter and Instagram. You can find me at ZK Redhead. So my two initials, Zachary Kancher, and then the red hair is always the standout. I always like to joke that if I'm in the gym watching you play and the lights go off, you can just follow me to the exit sign. It'll illuminate everything, But yeah, TowsonTigers.com is our university, Towson University, Towson.edu. TowsonTigers.com is our athletic department. And then at ZK Redhead on social media. So I don't do TikTok. I don't do Snapchat. It's past my bedtime at that point.
Highly recommend you guys follow him. Zach, thank you so much for your generosity in terms of giving us your time. And guys, we will see you again next week.